What is up, fellow sickos? I'm coming at you solo because De'Aaron Fox reportedly requested a trade or is urging the Kings to move him. Let's talk about it. Before we get started, though, just a reminder, our Eastern Conference trade deadline primer is already live. 2+ hours of us breaking down every team, assets, needs, targets. Our Western Conference one will be going up probably immediately on Wednesday after we record it because stuff gets so dated at this point, and that's why I want to talk about De'Aaron Fox, that we don't have to spend too much time on the Kings when there's 14 other teams to talk about in that one, although we'll probably have some additional news by then. Let's get into the De'Aaron Fox stuff, though. He has, today, Damian Barling of ESPN 1320 initially had the report that Fox and the Kings had a productive or a positive meeting today. I guess this is what constitutes positive. We then have Shams Charania of ESPN, Sam Amick of The Athletic reporting that Rich Paul, his agent of Clutch Sports, has basically told the Kings they should move him because he isn't going to sign an extension. And however, following that, well, actually 2 reports following that, James Ham of ESPN 1320 said that the San Antonio Spurs are the destination Fox wants to go to. There's been some, I would say, unconfirmed reporting that he's been planning this for quite some time, that his family's already kind of been in the area plotting going there. I don't subscribe to that just yet. I would need to see someone who is more established come out with such a report. But Damian Barling follows up the reporting that De'Aaron Fox wants a trade by saying that Fox will sign an extension with the Spurs or the Kings, which leads you to wonder if the Kings are somehow still in the mix here. I wonder, to the extent that they're still in the mix, is this De'Aaron Fox trying to leave the Supermax extension in play, 5 years, $342 million this summer? That's only going to happen if he makes All NBA. And at this point, I don't know if the Kings would even want to pay it. I also don't think he's going to make All NBA. Some of that may be unfair, but I feel as if a lot of the narratives or impressions or perceptions of the Kings have already been decided. And so that would substantially hurt, even if he finishes the year on a tear. And he's been, by and large, pretty good this year. You could look and worry about his jumper. He's still shooting 37% on step back threes, 54% on driving floaters, but we've seen some down ticks overall in the floaters in general, as well as the 3-point shot. Concerns there. But I wonder how much of that has to do with we want to leave that extension on the table in the event he makes All NBA, or is it actually we're just trying to apply pressure to the Kings to do something, anything to improve this roster? And that's probably the first perspective to tackle it from. This sucks for Kings fans. I mean, it always sucks for fans, but it's like Sacramento has been entrenched in such self-inflicted turmoil for decades that it felt as if they emerged from it in 2022. And even like kind of last year, viewing it as a step back, not making the playoffs, they only had a couple fewer wins. The Western Conference is hellfire. They didn't make any moves at the trade deadline, but it was okay. Recalibrate over the offseason, come back with something better. You didn't. You went medium lengths to go get DeMar DeRozan, who I think definitely addressed a need. We've had this conversation many times over, but it came at the cost in other areas or while overlooking other areas. When I say it came at a cost of other areas, aside from that, mainly that pick swap that is going out, and I think it's, 2030? It's what has happened to Keegan Murray on the offensive end. Like, it's just, he's been, when you even look at the usage, even as the efficiency comes up, it's just a different type of usage. And so did you inadvertently cap his development by having DeMar DeRozan, De'Aaron Fox, Domas Sabonis, and Malik Monk all on the roster? I don't know, but you go do that and you wind up largely, not even largely the same, but you reach this point where Mike Brown gets fired. Even now, you have under Doug Christie, they've been 11-4. They have a top 10, they have a top 9 offense and a top 13 defense during that time. So they're 11-4. They've had some good wins during this stretch. They beat the Celtics. They beat the Rockets. That was a good win for them. So this is a team that can clearly do something, but you look at it and you wonder, was De'Aaron Fox plotting this for a while? Like, this is from the Clutch Sports playbook, and Shamit Dua of the In the Know podcast pointed this out. This was my first thought. I was like, oh, he's got a year and a half-ish left on his deal before free agency. This is right out of the Clutch Sports playbook. It's actually the same date. This is, again, from Shamit Dua of In the Know podcast in 2019, from when Anthony Davis requested that initial trade from the Pelicans. He ended up not being traded that season. He made his way to the Lakers that offseason. The fact that De'Aaron Fox has a destination in mind, if you're looking to get out, in theory, this is the smart play. If you want to make sure you get to your destination, other teams might come out of the woodwork, but some of them that you would expect to maybe be aggressive. Let's look at the Rockets for one. They have very little reason to do so right now in the middle of the season when you look at them contending for a top 2 spot in the West. If they need to reorient over the summer, that's the summer. And so you kind of take them out of the equation. That helps Fox if he really wants to get to San Antonio and be with Wemby. And so I get that line of thinking, but you do have to ascribe not just a certain level, but a massive level of blame to the Kings front office here. If the reporting from ESPN is true, that Ramona Shelburne piece, they didn't consult anybody on the firing of Mike Brown, which seems pretty stupid. I'm not, I think we get annoyed sometimes when, maybe not Grant and I specifically, but people in general get annoyed when it feels like star players have too much power. But if you really didn't give De'Aaron Fox a heads up, and was that ESPN piece enough to pump the brakes on the messaging that De'Aaron Fox had nothing to do with it? Now, did De'Aaron Fox want Mike Brown to stay? He was also reportedly confronted heading into this season saying he didn't want another coach. Whether that changed or not, the organization's job here would be to kind of protect perception of the player, because ultimately, no matter how much a player would want a coach gone or a decision or a trade to be made, this would loop back in the Lakers for people who kind of blame LeBron and AD for the Russell Westbrook deal fiasco. It's on the front office to keep their stars in check, but also to protect their stars. And the Kings have failed there, not only in terms of it's still floating around the ether, was De'Aaron Fox responsible for this, or did his future have anything to do with it? Maybe in terms of urgency, the Kings worrying about reaching this point specifically, but you failed there. You've also just failed to optimize the product on the court after you make that 2023 playoff run. Let's say that DeMar DeRozan was the right acquisition. You still didn't do, what is this, year 3, 4 of all right, what's the backup big rotation going to look like? Because Trey Lyles, is that really enough? And then could we get another wing type in here? Keon Ellis finally playing. Again, that was always weird, but Keon Ellis getting minutes, great. Devin Carter coming back healthy. Were you kind of saddling your hopes just on all that? Was okay, it's DeMar DeRozan, and then we're going to have Devin Carter once he gets healthy and more minutes for Keon Ellis with the way he closed last year. And that was just supposed to make you a contender in the Western Conference. I will say everything the Kings have done, and even the Kevin Huerter trade has aged pretty poorly, to where you're asking that first round pick obligation still floating around out there. And you have no guarantee that just because of how hellacious the Western Conference is right now, that's going to convey. But the special of, what can Kevin Huerter plus the first round pick get you on the trade market? That just kind of never carried less weight. And then do you trust this front office to even, and let's say the De'Aaron Fox stuff isn't happening, do you trust the front office to even go out and make moves and upgrades? Because they've kind of proven that they're not necessarily going to do that mid-season. There's just, since the Tyrese Haliburton, Domantas Sabonis trade, this has not been their MO. Being able to recalibrate on the move. I'll say even Malik Monk, that happens over the offseason. So they deserve some credit there. They deserve credit for seeing in Keegan Murray defensively what I don't think anyone else saw. You deserve credit for finding Keon Ellis, but there's a limit to all of this. And the way that they've handled the coaching situations, the Mike Brown extension and the reporting around it, then of course his firing, just really bad. And I think you look at this team, and did the front office, did ownership decide that competence was just good enough? Okay, we'll challenge for the playoffs and that's just going to be enough. They should have operated with more urgency and more coherence when it came to addressing yes, I will say a lot of people wanted them to get another shot creator because things had bogged down for them. Their crunch time record is what it is this year. And the other thing here is, I don't know that if you had Malik Monk coming back, I don't know that you can sit here and say with a straight face that needed to be their top priority. I would have argued that kind of the other wing type, or other, maybe a bigger defensive player, maybe a combo big, even though you have Sabonis, someone who could play alongside Sabonis, not necessarily just his backup, that would have done more for this team than a DeMar DeRozan. I'm not saying that he was a terrible fit. I'm not saying even that deal was terrible. I think the logic there was questionable. It felt like a half measure where it's, Zach LaVine is the better fit, just because you look at off the dribble jump shooting, off ball jump shooting, but he's expensive. And DeMar DeRozan, we didn't have to give up any tangible first round equity for him. He's cheaper on a per year basis. That's the move you made. That stuff in hindsight, again, I'm not saying that I thought the DeMar DeRozan move was going to blow up in their face and prompt De'Aaron Fox to leave. By the way, that's probably not what's prompting him to leave, nor is it. I've seen some people say, the Domas Sabonis contract really ruined the Kings. No, I mean, one, if that's the issue, and Sabonis has had one hell of a season, and his minutes, like his solo star minutes, have been the best on the team when you're looking at solo star minutes. I'm open to the idea that he's so unique, so specific of a player that at his position, you need to build around him in this ultra specific way that can make it tougher. But if you, let's just say you think the Domantas Sabonis contract or arrival is the issue, who did that? The front office. Who gave that? The front office, ownership. So you don't get to lay. I don't. First of all, I don't think we can point to a singular moment or transaction. I really don't think it has anything to do with Sabonis. Maybe that comes out, and I don't want to dismiss like everyone's opinion, but I find that absolutely just inane. Personally, the bigger issue seems like you gradually let yourself get here. There were warning signs earlier in this season when he had another meeting with the organization. And what did you do? You did the easiest thing, which was to change a coach, and that got you to this 11-4 record, but you're still hovering around the fringes of the Western Conference playoff. Not even the playoff. You're hovering around the fringes of the play-in discussion. While you can say, yes, the margins in the Western Conference are so thin, there are teams that are constantly there year in and year out now. The Thunder putting together something sustainable. The Grizzlies, when they're healthy, putting together something. The Nuggets, of course. And you could say, oh, well, the Kings don't have a player as transcendent as Shai Gilgeous-Alexander or as Nikola Jokic. Okay, fine. But isn't that part of the problem? You're going to sit here and say that like Ja Morant is so much more transcendent than De'Aaron Fox when you look at Ja Morant's availability over the years? No. The Grizzlies have built a deep-ass roster, one that can work. Speaking of an unconventional setup or players that in theory could, or personnel that in theory could create complicated, functional warts, awkwardness, and the Grizzlies are figuring it out anyway. Like, yeah, are you ever going to trust their floor space and their half-court attack? Probably not. Probably not. They figured it out anyway to be one of the 5 most efficient offenses in basketball so far. Even with the Rockets, do I necessarily trust their playoff offense? No, but they're getting it done anyway. Like, they've assembled a deep, coherent supporting cast. There's a lot of drafted and development there, but like they pounced on opportunities, probably more so than you can argue that the Kings have, or at least pounced on the right opportunities when you're looking at Dillon Brooks, when you're looking at Fred VanVleet. So my point of all this is to say, I think this was avoidable. And I think the Kings as an organization deserve a bulk of the blame more than, oh, De'Aaron Fox was always 1 or 2 feet out the door. He is not come across as a star player that's tried to wield leverage or been asking for out. I don't think that him passing on extensions in each of the past 2 summers had really anything to do with him angling to get to San Antonio specifically. It really did feel like more of a financial play. And maybe now he's kind of just dealing with the reality of last season, everything that's happened this season, staring at the Kings and saying, well, how are they supposed to get to the next level? That can prove grating, frustrating. And that's why he's now asking for the trade. Identifying now, what are the Kings going to do here? That's where it gets super interesting. It seems like he requested out. This is the headlines now. It would almost feel, like borderline franchise malpractice not to move him. But even though you might have known that his displeasure was growing, you have inside 2 weeks. You have basically a week to move De'Aaron Fox before the February 6th trade deadline. That's a lot to do in 7-8 days. You have to figure out, one, what is your aim in a post De'Aaron Fox era? Even if you think that Domantas Sabonis is your most important player or that Keegan Murray is the most important player in the building, are you rebuilding? Are you looking to fast track your acceleration without Fox? I've seen some stuff that the Kings could get better without De'Aaron Fox. Point me to the trade that makes the Kings better without De'Aaron Fox, and then we could talk, because I don't necessarily see it out there. Maybe you could balance your rotation out a little bit more, but in terms of a from scratch shot creator who can also table set for everybody else, the Kings do not have a better option on this roster. They are not going to get a player who does that in exchange for De'Aaron Fox. If you really wanted to argue, is there a 3-team construction where Zach LaVine does end up on the Kings, reunited with DeMar DeRozan, of course, and that somehow makes them, I guess, more like evens out the rotation in some way? There are other pieces coming. I would have to see it in practice, but I would rail against the idea that the Kings are going to be a better team now and immediately moving forward without De'Aaron Fox. What you would want to do is probably reorient at most, but kind of rebuild and almost start over, where it's all right. Like, maybe we won't do it now, but it's time to explore what's going to happen with Sabonis down the line this offseason. That gets into the awkward discussion of, what about this Kings front office do you trust to make the right decision in a trade. And they have to be under some semblance of pressure. So if they make the Fox move now, or even this offseason, should Monty McNair, Wes Wilcox all be assured of, okay, your job stability is here. They make that trade, they're still probably going to be feeling the pressure. And is that going to prompt them to make maybe more of a short-sighted move to say, hey, we can't afford to take a few steps back and plan around a longer term? Like, we need to do something now. That's not a great mindset to have entering trade talks when you're talking about your franchise centerpiece who is in his prime and in theory should command a haul in caps lock picks. Are you going to undermine that by accepting players that you think can help you win now? That is not, I don't think that's the right direction for Sacramento. It's all, of course, pending what the market is. Is the market just San Antonio? So forget about the Kings front office. Should they be the ones making this deal? The answer, by the way, the answer is no. Like, what have they done to endear themselves to fans or just in a vacuum to say like, oh yeah, like, no, this is the right regime for the job? Seriously. And now arguably you're at a point as the Kings where it would make sense to start over because you don't have a permanent head coach in place. Doug Christie still has that interim label. And now your franchise star wants out. Like, this is almost, you don't control your first round pick this year necessarily, but you can with the protections that are on it. I mean, as of right now, that thing's not going to convey. It's like you do kind of control the fate of that pick as well. Is this a sign that you should start over? Can you do that by dealing with the Spurs specifically? They've got plenty of picks. They've got all their own first. They've got extra Atlanta first. They've got some Minnesota Timberwolves stuff. They have the Bulls pick this year, technically, that's top 10 protected. So they can give you a future focused package. They're not going to be the team that gives you the return that can keep you competitive now. You would have to, this assumes that they even want to give up Jeremy Sohan or Steph Castle, which I don't think the Kings would have much interest in either, to be honest with you. Maybe Sohan. But the bigger thing here is if you think that the Kings are going to get Devin Vassell out of this, I have a couple bridges I would like to sell you, and I will happily eat crow if I'm wrong, but you're not getting Devin Vassell for De'Aaron Fox. And if you do, I may argue that you're getting very little, if anything else. His contract, he's under lock and key longer term. And no, De'Aaron Fox is the better player, but like part of the appeal if you're the Spurs would be pairing De'Aaron Fox with Victor Wembanyama and Devin Vassell. You can say Steph Castle too if you're that big a believer in what his offense could become. Sure, but his defense, absolutely. But he arguably becomes a little bit more expendable if you're bringing in De'Aaron Fox, or you're just hoping that, or not hoping, you've now assumed that Steph Castle's never going to profile as that floor general type. Fine. So now you have to talk about roping in third and fourth teams, and is San Antonio going to send out enough draft equity to get the Kings stuff that they want? If the Kings don't want a future-focused return, those are iffy waters to traverse, as is just dealing with the Spurs in general. If they want De'Aaron Fox, they might give up stuff to get him. Will they do it mid-season at a time when doing so? I mean, maybe their own first is headed out here, but they're a team that, as I'm recording this, is 12th in the Western Conference. Are they going to feel the urgency to accelerate their position this season? No, probably not. So maybe they lowball you, especially because they are the only team that's on De'Aaron Fox's list. But I'd be curious as to know what their best midseason package would be. That might be something they're prepared to revisit over the offseason. And look, if you're the Kings, it might make some sense for you to revisit it over the offseason as well, because you don't want to damage the value of this. Like, maybe the Spurs are sending you this year's draft pick, like wherever the actual number is. They'll be worse without De'Aaron Fox this season. That's an interesting level of gamesmanship here. Now, you could say, what if Fox goes the Jimmy Butler route and becomes a borderline malcontent? He has given very few public indications, even when it comes to his demeanor on the court, that he would ever follow that route. And it also, if he's past the trade deadline, it doesn't really behoove him to do so. He's one under contract for at least another year, but like, what are you going to do at that point? The Kings might shut you down anyway. So there, what are you going to, if you go, let's just say he's playing an egregiously bad on purpose. What does that do for him aside from hurt his trade value around the league at a time when that type of demeanor isn't going to get you moved because the trade deadline has passed? And so I don't think you need to worry about this. If I'm the Kings, I'm still trying to slow play this. And if he is willing to sign an extension with you still, a base extension, a base max extension this summer would be, I think, 4 years, $229 million. If he's still open to staying with you long term, you need to gauge the legitimacy of that feeling before you then go out, because now creates this weird dynamic at the trade deadline of you can't be trading really. And I mean, yeah, if you can get someone for Kevin Huerter and Trey Lyles, go ahead and do it anyway. But can you really promise a first round pick that'll be at least 2 years into the future, if not more? Should you not convey this year's pick to Atlanta when you don't know what's going to happen with De'Aaron Fox? That was kind of always the dilemma. And so they may be boxed into a corner in that regard. But is there, if there is a real chance that he would stay or consider signing an extension, maybe you just ride the rest of this season out just to see how good you are. And then you could come to him with your plans over the offseason once you either see what the landscape is for, his services. Just because, again, I do think teams like even Orlando might be reticent to make a midseason move as they're trying to feel out, okay, what do we look like now that Mo Wagner's done for the year? But we have Franz Wagner and Paolo Banchero back. Jalen Suggs is kind of banged up, though. Do we really want to move Anthony Black? And so there will be other teams that then come out of the woodwork, other teams that open up even more draft equity that they could send you. And the Kings themselves may have a better lay of what they're working with in terms of assets. This is still pretty bleak if you're a Kings fan. And I don't know, if you're going to move him mid-season, what are the chances that it's not to the Spurs then at this point? I mean, could Orlando still be involved? I guess, sure. I really would be shocked if Houston became involved here. We've already had reporting that says the Lakers are not on Fox's list, and just in a vacuum, the first round picks that they could give up, 29 and 31, that's just not going to be enough compared with the matching salary they could send out, I would assume, relative to what the other offers are going to be. I mean, Phoenix could get weird, but you're not taking Bradley Beal back here, and those 3 first round picks they could give you are just kind of blah. Would the Warriors be interested? Maybe. They'd be an interesting De'Aaron Fox team, and they have a crap ton of assets, and they have a bunch of first round equity they could play around with. The messaging has also kind of been that they don't want to do anything like that. They're just going to ride out mediocrity with Steph and Draymond there. And then because they don't have their bridge to the future already in play, you're either going to hope you find that by drafting in the late lottery or middle of the first round, or just wait to reset until the, Steph requests a trade, I guess, or until he actually retires. I suppose I'm trying to think of what other teams could really convince themselves here to make a run and just have the assets to do it. Oklahoma City would be fairly interesting. I'm not just saying this because they have all the assets in the world, but you could send out their flexibility under the luxury tax is kind of almost unheard of for a team that's in a position to be maybe the title favorite this season. So you don't have to send out a ton of money, and all their contracts are pretty much good. If you're getting a Wiggins, a Joe, and a bunch of first round picks for De'Aaron Fox, you haven't compromised future flexibility, and maybe you're getting a bunch of draft equity moving forward. And then maybe you're still pretty good this year just because you've increased the depth of your roster. At the same time, they're not a team that's they don't need to make seismic midseason moves. And they might want to go through another postseason push if Chet Holmgren's going to be healthy and say, okay, do we actually need another primary offensive weapon there? It puts the Kings in a tough spot. And the right call here is to not rush anything. Even if you think the De'Aaron Fox era is over, which it does, it feels over. It feels like it will not last beyond this season. And that if it does, something's gone terribly wrong, or the Kings are being incredibly reckless, or they've gotten super lucky here. And that's kind of just the state of things. And I think that the first and foremost, the blame needs to just be laid at the feet of the Kings organization for allowing it to get to this point where their actions, I would say, have been, you could harp on some of the hits, some of the semi hits, some of the misses, but the biggest misses might just be the stuff they never did or let go unresolved. We're in year, again, I think 3, maybe 4 of talking about kind of the same biggest roster needs, roster holes that they've always had. And some of their logic has just been the way they've gone about things. Certainly Mike Brown has been pretty terrible. And to be 11-4 over your last 15 games, and this is the storyline now that your best player, second best player, whatever you want to call him, wants out, that's disastrous. And I do think that's a reflection of the organization to some extent, which is why I feel so bad for Kings fans who do not deserve this, just given the loyalty that they've shown to the organization through thick, but mostly thin over the past couple decades. And even I guess the right call, if you're the Kings at this point, to wrap up here, would be, I don't know if it has to happen this season, but it's to lean towards the future focused return. And you need to somehow then drum up a market outside San Antonio. There was some reporting that Brooklyn would be interested, but was that only they're hoarding 2026 cap space and that's when they'll be interested? Or are they willing to give up, okay, not this year's first, but will they give you those future draft picks that they have still kind of in their clip Nick, a lot of Knicks draft picks. Like, are they willing to build a package around that? And then if so, like the Kings really have to have a vision of the future there because they don't have these blue chip prospects that they're going to send you back, which is why that's so unappealing. But I do think that's the right decision, not to accept necessarily a Brooklyn type of package, but you need to now gear up, kind of start over. And I think part of that is not just the De'Aaron Fox return, but it might just be cleaning house in the front office, hire someone new to run it. Then you figure out the head coaching stuff. Ownership is going to remain the same. That is perhaps the biggest issue here. But you can't really do anything about that. And so I think that the Kings here, they need to look at this and say, all right, yeah, if there's a package on the table that's really good from the Spurs or someone else in advance of February 6th, fine. But you can't rush into something just because one, he asked her out, and two, that you're so bent on saving face or remaining as good as possible without him, because that's ultimately just not, that is franchise malpractice. You need to take the best offer, whatever it is. Maybe that includes a bunch of players where you're still able to field a competitive team. But if the right call is, well, we're going to take this team comes calling with a bunch of draft, we have a chance to get 4 first-round picks and some swaps or something, and maybe some players. You have to think in those terms now. Like, that's the point that you've reached. It was hard enough with De'Aaron Fox to envision the Kings getting to the level of, let's just say, like OKC, where Houston is now, the Cleveland, the Boston tier, even maybe where New York is or Memphis is or Denver is at this exact moment. Not talking about, Denver already won a title, so not talking about the past. It was already hard to envision them getting there because they're so asset strapped, independent of Keegan Murray and De'Aaron Fox, and let's just say Sabonis. And those are all players in theory that you want, like you need if you're trying to be as competitive as possible. You could trade distant first, but now you can't. You can't do something like that at the trade deadline because you don't know what's going to happen with Fox. So that's where the Kings are at right now. I don't think they've earned the benefit of the doubt when it comes to making the right decision here, just based how this has played out. I will be fascinated to see what happens. This throws definitely an interesting curveball into the 2025 trade deadline, where it kind of looked like we'll see Jimmy Butler get moved because he has to at this point. What other big names are going to go? Like, there's a real case that, Dorian Finney-Smith was the second or third best player to get moved to the deadline, unless you thought that a Levine or a Beal trade was going to happen for Jimmy Butler. And there might be other curveballs coming, but this certainly heightens the intrigue. And you also have to wonder, and maybe this is something Grant and I will get into when we talk about the Kings and that mega primer. Again, be on the lookout for it. Go check out. We did the East. Lots of good stuff in there. Does this impact, like, Jimmy Butler's trade demand is keeping other business on hold? Now, how many of the Jimmy Butler teams, the costs are night and day. It's not going to cost as much in assets. Salary, sure, it's going to cost more. It's not going to cost as much in assets to get Jimmy Butler. But how many of the teams that in theory might have been considering Jimmy Butler outside of Phoenix, and like how many other Jimmy Butler destinations were there actually? How many of those teams, let's, like, if it's the Warriors, like if it was the Suns, or if Memphis really was looking at a Jimmy Butler trade, how many of them could now hold up business because they want to check in on De'Aaron Fox? The teams I named, I mean, if the Warriors are actually involved in the Jimmy Butler sweepstakes, I'm skeptical, but if they were, like, they might be a team. You're not going to say Milwaukee, or really even, I mean, Fox would be a good fit in Phoenix. They just don't have, they need someone like Jimmy Butler where the asset value has torpedoed for them. So this will be interesting. It completely changes maybe not the complexion, but the potential for what happens at the NBA trade deadline. We're going to sit here. We're going to wait for what happens. We're going to react to it. We're going to analyze to it. And again, be on the lookout for our Western Conference trade deadline mega primer dropping probably like Wednesday evening at this rate, because stuff is becoming dated so quickly. Until next time. And as always, I leave you with the shout out to the one, the only, the indelible, the real fix for what ails the Sacramento Kings right now, with or without De'Aaron Fox. He could make them the title favorite, Mr. Frank Ntilikina.